I give a fuck? Why do I give a fuck? Why do I try so hard? Why do I care so much?
Welcome to Why Do I Give a Fuck? A cross-cultural conversation between myself, Diane Tate,
and Johanna Thompson. In these times of great struggle and possible shift, we ask ourselves,
why do we give a fuck about any of it? How does the lens we see the world through impact what we see?
And what do we do about it? Well, I mean, we're going to continue to have this conversation about what we heard out of Donald Trump's acceptance speech or inaugural speech is what I want to say. And some of the things that I really appreciated that you highlighted, I'm going to let you kind of jump into that
Oh, good.
about the victimization of.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about how he was, in a certain section of his speech, he was talking about how we weren't going to allow other countries to take advantage of us anymore, that we were going to tariff all of their imports, that he was, what did he say? He was going to create an external Department of Revenue.
The ERS, the
The
External Revenue
ERS, yeah,
Service.
instead of the
Hmm.
IRS. But so we're no longer going to let the rest of the world take advantage of us. We're no longer going to let the rest of the world think we're weak. And as I was processing and I was thinking about what a victimization trope he had going during most of his inaugural speech, that this country was this great harbinger of resources, that we had all of this wonderfulness that people were taking advantage of and taking from without any payment. And I'm like, it's amazing to me how oblivious he and others can be about how this country makes nothing. We have very few resources. We have oil, which he did talk about, drill baby drill. He
Hmm.
wants to start doing that again, which is just ecocide. But we don't create anything here except violence and
Hmm.
militarization and control and occupation. And yet his vision of this country was this enormous victim, and how he had to come in and be the strong man to protect, and he was going to put these things in place to protect our country and our citizens. And it just it's pretty disgusting, but and
I,
so
I, I,
completely not in reality.
I giggle because what I experience it as, and I don't, just naming that I am not a white male person, I've not lived the
Mm.
experience of a white male, but being in community with folks in the past, and not in the past, in the present also. And there, to this trope that you're speaking of, it's a very individualistic place that
Like,
white maleness has gotten to. Like I've
mm,
in working in business world and doing the consultations that I have, there is this moment where those that are in power, and it's typically in the United States, a white male is in leadership, and across the globe you see that.
mm,
But this victimization of, because hypermasculinity has been called in, because white supremacy has been called in, because
mm,
limited, unexpanded thinking has been called in, and the face of that is white maleness. White maleness has taken on this very, I am being beat up all the time by everyone from every space.
right.
And when that happens, to Darwin's point, when he realized that it was a very small percentage of white maleness that existed across the globe, it was like, I'm only here, and how do I exist, and how do I continue to be
Mhm.
powerful, or to even just be, because I am not the center. And realizing that you're not the center, but wanting to place yourself in the center is how we come to white supremacy, how we come to these structures of hierarchy and power position. Because when folks feel like they don't have power, they try to figure out ways to take it. And I have to say, whiteness and white supremacy and colonization has been brilliant about being able to do that.
Mm,
Um, Brilliant, right? Because the world is colonized, and the world looks to whiteness for leadership,
yep.
which we shouldn't, because this is where we get the harm. And it's also just like not the natural production of like our entire existence.
Mm,
And so it's really also very interesting to be looking at the hurt white male who has existed in privilege and resource and all of the autonomy of choice and decision making for everyone else in power to feel hurt and then be wanting to return. And then I'm just checking in with all the other people who are really comfortable with that system and that structure because we've agreed to allow it to be what our leadership is. And then I'm on. I wanted to talk about being here, the land of wood and water, which folks can see on my name, which is what Jamaica is known. That's what Jamaica means, the land of wood and water. And so
Oh,
I'm here, in a country of out of many, one people, which is very true. There is every component of the diaspora in Jamaica. I know that the narrative on US territory is that most people walk around with locks, smoking weed, and having a lot of sex all day and listening to reggae music and eating good food, right?
uh,
So that's like the invitation narrative. This is an island nation of a very proud people that is rooted in faith. Christianity has, colonized onto the island, but then there are very strong indigenous practices of knowing your history and knowing where you're from and like, you know, people are associated by their surnames and that's how you know who is what where and community is small here. So it's really interesting to be having conversations with people about what the Trump administration looks like and how they feel about it because to like the point, I think it's happening in Ecuador, where there was a huge prison that was built by the Ecuadorian president, and he like apparently locked up 20,000 people. I'm hearing this from the Chata in the community. I have not done any research about it, but those are positions of respect, of authority that I am seeing culturally being upheld and praised here in Jamaica. So that being true, Jamaica also still existing in a very hyper masculine structure, existing in UK kingdom type colonization. So,
right.
you know, people have to vouch for your character here. Like when you're going to get a license, someone has to sign a paper that says that you are worthy of having the privilege of driving or worthy of having the privilege of being in a community or even getting a bank account. You have to get people to like co-sign for you here. So it's a very European colonization type of way.
Okay.
And what I find in having conversations with folks who, most folks in Jamaica identify as non-white, I should say, even if they are white skinned, they identify as non-white humans. And Trump and the Trump administration and the rhetoric that came out of the electorate during election season,
Hmm.
a lot of folks are very aligned with that. So there's also a culture in Jamaica where folks go to the United States or go to Canada during seasons to work and make money, and then they come back and build up their community and lives. And that's why you see all these big mansions here and stuff like that. It's Jamaican owned because they're making money and then they come back and bring it, right? That might be something that the Trump administration does not take too kindly to
Yeah.
because it's American resources that are coming back to the state, to a different nation. But folks are happy with this idea of someone coming in being very authoritarian in their leadership, being very clear about what is and is not acceptable behavior. They believe and have experienced or did experience during the Trump administration an abundance of wealth and being able to make money, even during COVID, traveling over and then coming back into community. And so it's really it's confusing also to sit amongst folks that are non-white identified people who are so supportive of Trump. But then when we talk about issues of what racism actually looks like and experience, because again, on an island nation of predominantly non-white identified people, racism is experienced completely differently. And racism typically will come from folks coming to visit and not really be the cultural context of the social fabric of the folks here. And so as conversations go on and they're like, okay, well, this doesn't seem like really racist behavior. When you start outlining like the history of the institution and and how people don't get access or resource to something because of racism, then folks kind of like soften up to understanding why there is a faction of or demographic of humans that are not supportive of Trump in the way that they are supportive, because the male female issue of gender, that's 100% something that folks will be supportive of. Not being open to giving platform to marginalized communities, specifically trans communities, or any of those type of things being in books in schools or being explored, that none of that is acceptable. And so there is a support for those things where it's like the US has lost its mind in its entirety. And so Trump um, represents the US coming back into some sort of
Oh, okay.
sensibility. I think in Trump's speech he said common sense, right? And
Right.
so this idea of what common sense is what is foundationally what people are excited about
Uh,
returning to in regards to the Trump administration on an
oh,
island that hasn't had the history of the experience.
interesting. Okay. So I heard you say, and I wanted to make sure I understood. So I heard you saying that folks that you've been talking to, or just the ideologies of the thought processes that you've been learning about since you moved there, is that they would be okay or in support of the binary gender focus, which Trump talked
100%.
about. And so they're not in support necessarily of a more fluid gender process. Okay, interesting. Interesting.
Not at all. And
Interesting.
things just and then when there's a curiosity about where this comes from, I every single person has said, let's look at nature. And if we are using nature to follow the course of what is right, what is wrong, there is a male and a female of everything in nature, right? So like that very binary construct of thinking, which is exists, right? The way that I approach that conversation is that there's variations of male and female in nature across time. So yes, there
Right.
might be a larger um, under the bell curve amount of people that fall into that, but there's always a spectrum. And so if we're in consideration of the spectrum, we know that there's not only a black and white. We know that nature gives us that
Mhm.
actually also, but that's not what the focus is. The focus is what is the majority under the bell curve. And so we're going to go with what the majority under the bell curve speaks
Mhm.
to as far as looking at nature. But that's not also, I mean, because I always bring up okay, well then, you know, if we're looking at nature, and whenever you throw curveballs and people start talking about stuff, they get a little frustrated. And we're looking at nature, then the order of nature is that the feminine, the female, is the decider of all things. We decide everything. Everybody has an X in their body in their DNA.
Mhm.
Not everybody got a Y. Everybody got an X though, because that is like the foundational component of like
Every human fetus is female
being.
until, like, I don't know, 20
Until
or
you
something like
find out
that. And then if
what
the Y is
what
going to
you're
develop, it develops. But before that, we're all
right. You
female.
are, we are all X's up in
Yes.
here. And
Yes.
so when you bring that and you think about what we have hints of, civilizations existed under matriarchies a long time ago, but we don't hear about it because of the way that we have been conditioned and
Mhm.
educated. Those are the things that you want to challenge when there's an opportunity to be thinking about how do we shift our social fabric. And
Right.
when folks go to like these things that are supposed to be so definitive and aren't thinking in an expanded way about what actually nature does show us, what we do exist in our natural state of being before people tell us how it is that we have to eat,
We're supposed to
how
be
it is we have
right.
to get up, when we have to like work. Somebody has programmed us into that. But if we were
Yes.
in our natural baby states, when you come out, you need to eat, you need to sleep every 4 hours, you need to get up, like there's things that we are not allowed to just naturally evolve and exist into
Right. Right.
because social construct exists.
Yeah, it's so interesting because when you were telling the story, or talking about the pushback that you, and that's my word, that you get when you talk about, kind of gender fluidity, as well, look at nature. And it made me think of how I could identify with, at one time in my life, thinking like that, well, It's always been like this. And the thing that's different for me now is that I question all of the things that I've always thought should be. So, but you have to make, not you have, I don't mean you have to. I think we have to internally and intentionally question that, because like you said, we are trained, we're indoctrinated from the
Birth.
first breath that
Mhm.
this is the way things happen, this is the way things are unfold. And but that's not the case. And so the thing that I'm learning now is questioning, why was I taught that? Who taught it to me? What's the context? Why was that? What's the end result of me thinking that this is supposed to be the way? What was somebody trying to accomplish by teaching me that this was supposed to be the way? And I had to learn how to do that. I didn't know how to do that before. And that's why I said, I've said in previous episodes that, I'm questioning now that binary thinking. Anytime I find myself in a binary thinking where there's this side or there's that side, it's a red flag for me. And I don't always get it like right away. Sometimes I'm in it for a minute before I realize that I'm doing it again. But when I find it, when I see it, it's like, okay, you know, I'm it may be that if I challenge the binary, or I challenge what I'm looking at, I'll still find the reason why I'm thinking that way. It may be that that's the way to look at it. But I need to question that mindset, because that's the thing that I was taught, and who taught it to me, and why did they teach it to me, and is there an ultimate intentionality behind upholding, systems and tropes and ideologies that continue to keep me in that indoctrinated, I'm just going to uphold what's in front of me because that makes me feel more comfortable space. And so that's my challenge for the rest of my life, is to always be looking at that. And so, yeah, when you were telling that story and I identify with that, I was like, I probably was one of those people that, I was like, yeah, well, that's
Yeah.
in nature. There's a male and a female. So therefore, you know,
Mhm. We
and I,
all we all come to that, right? Because there are
yeah,
components of that that's real. Like when you that there is a real component to that. And this is not to say that when you start to question where your foundational thinking is, that if you come up with whatever works for you and it's not creating harm to yourself or others,
mhm,
that's okay. Nobody's saying not to be in that.
right.
Like nobody is saying, oh, you have to do this thing. No, but you can be like, just allow somebody else to do the thing if that's what they want to do, as long as it's not harming you. There also was a conversation that I had was like, well, what if it harms me to like be in consideration of people's pronouns? And I'm like,
How do
how is that any
you,
different than being in consideration of people's names? Because everybody has a different name. So you're just gonna call everybody, I'm gonna call everybody who looks male presenting to me John, and everybody who looks female presenting to me Jane. That doesn't even make sense, right? It just literally doesn't make sense. So why, if we're talking about common sense, how is a calling up somebody a pronoun hurting you? And then for people who need other pronouns and folks that don't understand that, some grace, right? Because folks have been indoctrinated into this thing, and the grace of, hey, that's not what my pronoun is, this is what my pronoun is, without it having to be a clash, is also very helpful in us developing an inclusive and collective society that actually can evolve in a harmonious way where people feel like they have their own autonomy and real liberation. That's what the goal is.
yeah,
But in this Trump administration and the presidency, it is still going back to, we are going to define in the golden age what it is that you can be, say, do, live, and experience. And that is scary. Scary, harmful, bothersome, stressful,
upholding the
all of the
binary,
things.
like institutionalizing the binary even more than it already is, because
Yeah.
they see it slipping, and they see the powers dynamic, they see the potential for the power dynamic to change, and they don't
Correct.
want that. So
Hmm.
they're so these next 4 years, my guess would be that the majority of the time is going to be spent institutionalizing and bedrocking, as much as law will allow, the binary. And I'm using the binary as a kind of a global term for that either or thinking. But it's so interesting how the argument is used that that's needed by this victimization.
Proposition. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's
Positioning. Yeah, yeah.
so
And
interesting.
it's
You
yeah,
want to
but
talk
as you're
about
talking
the
about the
strongest
binary,
nation in the world, and yet you're the biggest victim.
yes.
How does that? I
How does
don't.
that
That
That's what I'm
doesn't.
saying. All of the contradictions like make no sense. And if like we're
Yeah,
really thinking about this, you're saying that, oh, I'm gonna make sure that there's some form of a power balance and that people are included. At the same time, you're saying that you're gonna do this under a structure that is specifically hierarchical,
cheating,
right?
right?
And like if we're doing this binary, if we're moving in the binary in the way that we've been moving in the binary, the privilege of that, let's just go back to gender. Just the privilege of the binary and the way that different attributes have been associated to maleness and femaleness, to the feminine and to the masculine, it always will allow for the masculine to trump. There's a conversation here with Jamaican men that is like, if we are being gracious right now because we are not dominating everything. Because if we decided that we were going to dominate, the world would look different. And so I'm trying to understand, one, first of all, why do you want to dominate everything? Why is that so important for you to feel like you want to dominate everything? My body doesn't I don't have a bone in my body that wants to dominate something else. As a parent, I wanted to make sure that my children were kept safe and had a structure, but I didn't want to ever dominate them. As
Mhm.
a wife, when I was a wife, I didn't want to dominate my partner, my husband there at the time. Like there's no desire for me to dominate, but there is this kind of like superior domination ideology that exists within white supremacy that I cannot access. And I've tried a lot of ways to figure out like where in my life I would want to do that. And that just might be what my vibration is, but like I don't understand it. And it's not helpful. And it's never going to help anybody it's not helpful for us to be able to have shared power, and shared power gets us further than not.
Well, and what I
So,
heard you say was we're being gracious and not dominating, which is
mhm,
like, okay, are we supposed to say thank you for not
mhm,
dominating?
yeah,
I
yes,
that
like
that
but,
that's a whole
but
other
that's
toxic
what we're existing.
masculinity.
But that's what white supremacy is asking for in U.S. territory,
Mhm.
right? Be thankful that that we are not, that this is
That
what
we're
it is that you're
there.
getting.
Yeah, yeah,
Be thankful for this harm and violence to yourself because it's the right way.
yeah.
No, that doesn't make
We're
sense.
going to take care of women in ways that they've never been taken care of
We're
before.
going to take care of the poor.
Yeah,
We're going to tell you what you are supposed to eat. And sometimes it doesn't even, most of the people are unhealthy in the United States, and then United States diets being proliferated all across the globe is killing people.
yeah,
It's literally killing people.
yeah,
So it doesn't work. And everyone talks about it. Everyone is like, we're dying because of our food.
yeah.
But we're just allowing the food industry to continue to create more non-food products that we consume.
Right. Yeah. And be
I'm
grateful
just
for it
saying.
and say
And be
thank you
thankful.
and say
Thankful and grateful and
yes.
supportive of it. It is there's a whole psychology in this. This is a psychology that I don't want to follow.
Mm-mm.
I want to understand it. I want to analyze it, but I don't want to follow it. I don't want to follow it.
Do
So,
you,
and then
sorry,
ask the question.
do you regret, do you have any regrets about moving to Jamaica? No, none.
Mm.
Even with the dynamics that in some ways
Of
can feel,
hypermasculinity.
yeah, yeah.
So here's the interesting thing. I can I can exist, and I have to give myself a little giggle. I can exist in hypermasculinity because I'm a hyperfeminine human a
Yeah,
lot easily than trying to exist with the institutional racism and underlying devaluing of my body on US territory
gotcha,
and soil.
gotcha.
right? So it's just like the reality is that in Jamaica, as a presenting as a super hyper feminine, I have some privilege
Mm,
and safety, in a
mm,
way. You know what I mean? Like in a real weird kind of way, but in a way that makes me a lot more comfortable than being on US territory. And
gotcha.
then also there is there is colonization here and social structures that are very strong and very real. And in I'm aware of them, and like I said, I can exist in them a lot more comfortably than in the US. And so no, I don't regret that. And then there's also like a different type of humanity here, right? There is that one love does exist, right? When there's an issue of thinking about color blindness, color is experienced and seen here differently. So we always gonna have proximity to whiteness when colonization exists.
Right.
But you can have a very Asian looking person who is Jamaican, and they're a Jamaican person, and they're a Jamaican person. I don't
Hmm.
really know how to explain it. You can have a very white
They're not
looking
Asian
human.
Jamaican or,
Mm-mm,
none of that.
no, they're Jamaican. You can have a very white, identified looking person that until they open their mouth, you wouldn't know what, and they're Jamaican. So the color blindness that Donald Trump was talking about in his inauguration speech that he's trying to invoke on US territory, I don't see how that is possible to actually happen because of the institutional racism that exists and that continues to call in those differences. But living in a different on a in a different nation that has had a different experience with what racism looks like, you can see where people don't like, yeah. It's hard to explain because then there's social class, and class then looks completely different here. And
Right.
class becomes the thing that's much more elevated in the same way that racism is centered in the United States.
Right. Right. And getting back to his use of the word colorblindness, it's so interesting because I didn't understand in my early days of my awakening what colorblindness was. I thought that that whole concept of we all bleed red, isn't that a better, we're the human race, we're not. I thought all of those things were good and noble and all of the things until I've told this story before, until a black woman took the time to look at me and say, well, when you say you don't see color, you say you don't see me. And that,
Mhm.
that broke me open in terms of that, yeah, that was my light bulb moment. So it's interesting that I'll be curious to hear as people are talking about his inaugural address and what stuck out for them. The concept of colorblindness to whiteness. I was taught that colorblindness was a good thing, that not seeing somebody's color was actually a good thing. I was completely oblivious to the fact that I was all about making people all about whiteness. I didn't understand the difference between the two. I thought that we should just all get along and not see the differences between each other. And now I see that totally differently. So I'm curious to be, I would imagine there's going to be a segment of our population that heard him say that and think that he's actually advocating for anti-racism.
Yes,
Yeah,
100%.
yeah, yeah.
And thinking that understanding makes more sense and is a lot more kumbaya.
Right,
And I'm just going to offer the thought process that you're saying that in one case as regards to racism, but then you're saying that we're just going to have, male and female in regards to gender.
right,
And when you how can we be gender blind?
right. How
Right?
can
If
we
you want to
be
be
colorblind?
colorblind,
That's right.
let's be gender blind.
If we're going to be colorblind, then why not be gender blind too? Yeah, yeah.
Right? And then when you start thinking about it like that, you know that that's not actually what's real. And
It's
if
not
we're talking about like let's being what's real, then hey, I'm going to acknowledge that you were born with a vagina and assigned that at birth and your representation of yourself, and I'm going to call you female and you're going to be her, hers, she, her, hers, all of that.
yeah.
Okay. But then you're going to say that as far as race goes and colors and all of that, I'm going to be colorblind.
It's going to
But
be
with the gender thing, you also ascribe specific attributes to the feminine that is exactly what you say is natural and what is supposed to be, the same thing as far as race goes, right? You you know that there's attributes that go to different people depending on how they identify ethnically, that
Right.
we've done that in a social construct that doesn't actually make sense. It doesn't always align the same way with gender. So we have to be thinking about those things. And we're going to say one thing for one thing, but then do something different for another thing and change something for somebody over here.
Yeah.
That's when we're going to continue to have the harm, the violence, and the chaos that exists because we're not being real.
Yeah.
Why do I give a fuck? Why do
Thanks
I
for joining
give a
us.
fuck?
Until next time, as you move throughout your day, continue to ask yourself,
Why do I give a fuck?
Why Do I Give a Fuck is produced in collaboration with Johanna and Diane. Music by Norwegian musician Water. See you next time.